What I really want to talk about are some of the things that, some of the challenges that we're facing in managing flood risk, whether it's flood insurance or other aspects of how we are managing flood risk. There's really kind of two big obstacles I think we need to figure out how to overcome in our federal policies, and then how those trickle down to kind of the states and the local areas. One is just the historic trend that we have towards investing a lot more in post-disaster recovery and rebuilding efforts than we invest in pre-disaster mitigation efforts. That's reflected both in the funding at the federal and state and local level that's appropriated. That's also reflected in the policies. Most of our flood policies are structured towards reconstruction and recovery efforts, not exclusively, but there's a kind of a tendency to structure things to facilitate those types of activities primarily. And then, and even in the science, a lot of the science we rely upon is reliant on past experience. And in a changing world where the climate is warming and all of our past assumptions about how the world works are kind of evolving, and evolving much more quickly than we expect, we don't always apply the right science to the right questions, and therefore we're not always getting ourselves the right answers. And then the second big thing, which I've already mentioned, is climate change itself. Climate change is completely changing the equation, sometimes perhaps literally, for how we estimate flood risk and the actions that we take to mitigate it. So climate change doesn't make any of our problems any easier. It means we're basing things on a false assumption that yesterday's flood risk is equivalent to tomorrow's flood risk. A lot of the things that we do in our policies, we're not disincentivizing people from moving into floodplains to the extent that we need to. That's a growing problem because if floodplains are increasing in size, either in response to sea level rise or shifting precipitation patterns, we're only increasing our exposure the more people that move into those vulnerable areas. And we need to figure out ways to both incentivize people to move out of floodplains or areas that are going to be floodplains. And we need to figure out better ways of reducing our future flood risk and also make sure that we're, again, focusing more on pre-disaster mitigation rather than post-disaster aid. So just to give you a little summary of kind of, when you look at sea level rise in the United States, how high will it go? So there's a range of assumptions out there. Just a disclaimer, if you use the website cartoonizemyimage.com, this is actually me. If I take my glasses off, this will come up. Actually, that's not a real website, but there's a range of, and then I also got to just say, the not to scale disclaimer did not show up at the bottom of this image. But there's a range of sea level rise estimates out there. Back in 2013, the International Panel on Climate Change, convened by the United Nations, estimated about 3 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century would be the upper limit. So that doesn't sound all that bad. 3 feet, that seems like a completely manageable problem, although still serious. Unfortunately, the IPCC did not actually factor in the rapid melting of the polar regions of the globe, and that's something that scientists are increasingly seeing. So 3 feet could be a pretty optimistic estimate these days. The National Climate Assessment, which the U.S. released in 2014, did factor some of those things in, and their upper limit was about 6.6 feet. But if you look at sea level rise estimates, there's a funny thing. They always say by end of century, as if somehow the world knows on January 1st, 2100, that's it. That's the cap right there. We always have to remember that sea level rise is going to continue on for decades and even centuries afterwards. And when you look at some of the data about how high sea levels could go beyond the year 2100, it's really kind of a terrifying thing to contemplate. Climate Central and the Potsdam Institute estimate with just 1.5 degrees of warming, which is an extremely optimistic level of warming that was agreed to in Paris in December, we still result in about 9.5 feet of sea level rise. If you look at paleoclimate data, data on where were sea levels when the globe was of a similar temperature, you really start getting into some numbers that are scary. So that could be anywhere in the range of about 30 feet of sea level rise. That's a ways off. I mean, none of us are going to be here. Nobody that within generations of us is going to see that. But that's ultimately where we're going to be headed, possibly. And it's not just coastal regions that are going to be seeing an increase in flood risk. Inland rivers are also experiencing this as well. These are two graphs from a paper that was released in Nature Climate Change by two researchers at the University of Iowa. And they just looked at gauge data, and they found, lo and behold, something that we probably all know intuitively or quantitatively, that flood frequencies are increasing across the Midwest. The graph on the right is frequency, the graph on the left is magnitude. The magnitude of floods is not changing as uniformly as frequency. Frequency is certainly a concern. So there's, before I jump to this, can I go backwards? So before I jump to this, there are three things that I think are pretty interesting that are happening right now at the federal level that have a lot of promise for moving the nation in a different direction on how we manage flood risks. First and foremost is the executive order President Obama signed in January 2015, setting up an updated set of federal flood protection standards. That's something that FEMA has been taking a very large leadership role in creating the guidance for other agencies. Other agencies are now in the process of implementing that. So that's going to be a huge help. It really is all about moving the nation towards thinking about the changing face of flood risk in the nation and acting on that information, even in the face of some unknowns. Another big thing, which I also give a lot of credit to FEMA for, is a recent shift in policy where they're now requiring states to assess how climate change could affect the frequency and magnitude of natural disasters in their state hazard mitigation plans, something that a lot of you in the room are probably involved with developing. So that's a very proactive and smart move as well. You know, if you can't plan for a risk that you haven't contemplated the existence of, and making sure that we're really doing our due diligence in developing those plans. And that's information that also helps trickle down to the local level and influences their plans as well. The other big federal policy pillar that's going to be important to re-examine is flood insurance. Flood insurance is going to be up for reauthorization in 2015 or in 2017. And there's a lot of ideas out there for how it could be changed to better adapt to the circumstances we have around climate change. And that's a very difficult problem to crack. You have problems of the long-term solvency of the flood insurance program, which is about $23 billion in debt currently. You have the problem of rising flood risks, and how do you start to integrate that knowledge into how the flood insurance program operates. And then you have the competing tension of affordability. There's been a lot of debate about moving to risk-based prices, but that also comes at a literal cost to people that maybe can't afford that. So there's overall of that is how do you balance all of these things also in a way that's fair and equitable to the policyholders and the people that are directly affected by flood disasters. So one of the things that NRDC has come up with conceptually is an idea of giving discounts on flood insurance in exchange for perhaps a long-term guarantee on getting bought out once the property is substantially damaged. So I'm a little behind the fancy animation on my PowerPoint presentation. Maybe I should do that one more time. So the way this would work is people would be able to get a discount on flood insurance. They would also receive in exchange for that a buyout guarantee that could be backed by the federal government or state government. In the short term, the person would get to stay in their home. They would have flood insurance coverage. They would be able to stay there and also maintain their presence in their community. Their property value would be maintained. Hopefully this would be a guarantee that would transfer from owner to owner. But once their property is substantially damaged and they would be required to actually put more money into the property to mitigate against future flood risk, that's a perfect opportunity to step in and say, you know what, you live in an area that we know the flood risk is only escalating in. It doesn't make much sense to have you spend a lot of money to do something that may not stave off the inevitable. So that might be the perfect opportunity to actually step in and buy them out. And they would already have that guaranteed assistance through some sort of contractual obligation or some other mechanism. We don't think this is something that should be available everywhere in the country. We think it needs to be available to the people who really have a problem with affordability of flood insurance. And it shouldn't be involved everywhere. We need to really look closely at where a solution like this could be most viable. This isn't, we published this idea in a paper in the Environmental Law Reporter last year, but there are other similar ideas out there. The Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania just put a paper out earlier this week, I believe, with a similar proposal whereby people could perhaps get reductions in insurance costs in exchange for low interest loans for doing mitigation activity. So, kind of a similar deal. And people have also looked at this in other types of ideas as well. But it's this type of innovation, I think, that we need to be seeking in our federal policies. We have a rapidly changing world. Flood risks are changing right along with it, and not for the better. So it's time for people like everybody in the audience here to really kind of push ourselves to think a little bit differently about the solutions that we're applying to an age-old problem.